Welcome to North Pamunkey Baptist Church. I'm so happy to have you here with us today to learn more about the history of this congregation, begun in 1774. Bury Me at Pamunkey is available for sale now, with the proceeds going to support the cost of a historical marker on the grounds. I'm currently awaiting the June meeting to see if we made the cut this time. First and foremost, I give the glory to God. He is the one who put it in my heart to write this book for our 250th. He placed me in this church as a little one when my family moved to the Pamunkey neighborhood. My most precious memories are of this place. My soul was saved here when I was just 9 years old. That same year, I almost died due to an asthma attack and near drowning. God has always had a plan and a purpose for my life. I delight in serving him here in this place. So last March, I began researching what I could find out about our church and its founders. I very easily found many online resources available about the colonial times and lists of books to purchase and borrow. I visited the Goshen Baptist Association to retrieve old minutes dating back to the late 1790s. I also visited the Virginia Baptist Historical Society to view their Pamunkey files, as well as the Library of Virginia, to look at what they had on microfilm. All of these resources helped me pull together a beautiful story of a congregation that persisted through persecution, jail, hardship, inner turmoil, civil war, and the arrival of modern society that took many away from the church. So let's get started. Let's go back to June 4th, 1768. On this day, we have the first known instance of the group who would become known as the Dissenters being arrested. Swearing Jack, John Waller, was a converted member of the gentry who was then known as Preaching John. His church still exists today, Waller's Baptist Church. Lewis Craig was the founder of Upper Spotsylvania Church, present-day Craig's Baptist Church. These men refused to stop preaching, even though offered release. After a month, Lewis Craig was released and hurried to Williamsburg to petition for the others' release. For 43 days, these men were jailed and never ceased preaching. We recently learned that some of these men preach with their arms outstretched from the prison bars, and men would come through and cut their arms as they preached. So they were under heavy persecution. I'll mention Nathaniel Saunders briefly for his connection to Pamunkey. While not our minister, these dissenters often interacted, and Saunders is mentioned in the same circles as Aaron Bledsoe, our first minister. Going back 6 and 7 generations, we can connect him as the grandfather of current members in our congregation through the Pierces and the Pews. And both descendants are here today. Surprisingly, Nathaniel Saunders is also the 6 times great uncle of me, by way of my grandmother's tally side. So the dissenters face much persecution as evidenced here. John Regasta in Wellspring of Liberty uncovered many details of their treatment. And I'll let you take a look at some of the things that they had to deal with. And this slide gives us the names of many of those persecuted. It's a little smaller than I was envisioning. But it is believed that at one point over half of the Baptist ministers had been in jail. So this brings us to Elijah Craig. Elijah Craig was the brother of Lewis Craig, previously mentioned, and he was also jailed in 1768. And he first set up Blue Run Baptist in 1769, followed by Rapidan in Madison in 1773, and then our little meeting house the following year. It was first called Bledsoe's Meeting House. Based on the Stevens and Brockman names who owned land in the Pamunkey neighborhood, this is most likely the reason the first log structure was placed here. We know that the church began with 20 members though no records exist from that time. Soon after I began serving on the board, Mike Saxton mentioned the 10,000 names petition, or the dissenters petition, to me. It became crucial for me to view this petition, and maybe even a little bit obsessed, viewing the petition to see if I could find some names that could potentially be the original members. Here are, and this is the opening of that petition, and I put it in cursive, but this is much easier to read than most of their handwriting in that petition. I believe that several of the founding members are listed on the right side here with their minister, Aaron Bledsoe, and I marked with arrows the names of Elijah Craig on the left side and Aaron Bledsoe on the right, and the people below him, I believe, probably all met together and signed the document together. This church would have been meeting for 2 years at that point. These dissenters pressed hard in colonial Virginia for an end to their oppression in exchange for the support needed to fight the American Revolution. Afterwards, when the Constitution came along, the Baptists led the way in opposition to its ratification without protection of religious liberty. So from that list that I previously mentioned, I also compiled, these are names that I found within the petition, and I used this to gain an idea of who some of the early members of Pamunkey could have been. And I think Brockmans are a pretty good bet because the Brockmans lived just a hop, skip, and a jump away. Robert Elkins was talked about in another book that I have found, and we see names like the Mallorys and the Kendalls and the Graves and the Bickers and the Bells, who are all Pamunkey names. So here's a letter from Joseph Spencer. He was a Revolutionary soldier. I don't know if it's the same Joseph Spencer that also was a jailed preacher at one time. I'm not sure if it's the same one. However, he urged Madison to meet with John Leland to hear about Leland and other Baptists' objections. So notice the other names there. You'll notice Mr. Bledsoe and Sanders. And of course, we know what happened next. The special meeting under the big oak tree, not too far from here. Here's another letter from James Madison to his father about how he was sending copies of the Federalist for Bledsoe and for Leland. The Pamunkey Meeting House clearly played a role in the discussion of what would become the First Amendment. So Elijah Craig did not stay in Orange. His family had left Virginia as part of the traveling church, which is a fascinating little read. He would join them around 1785, and of course, Mr. Craig became more well known in history for some of his other activities. So that's Elijah Craig. He didn't stay, but Aaron Bledsoe was the minister for 32 years. And in 1806, there were some reports of some fraudulent activities that led to his dismissal. Soon after, he and his family headed to Georgia, where he died soon after. Goshen minutes from the era discuss that a rotation of ministers was appointed to fill in monthly, as meetings were really only held about once a month during this time. One of those ministers on that list would eventually become the next full-time minister, and that's Jeremiah Chandler. Jeremiah Chandler simultaneously served Pamunkey and Piney Branch, and years after his death, over 100 marriage licenses were discovered in his saddlebag, and this is an image of one of the pages of those. His great-great-grandson lives in Fredericksburg, and I have spoken with him, and he has possession of many of those items and told me to come anytime, and he'd show them to me. And he is hopeful to attend our 250th celebration when we have it in September. By the 1830s, we were back on track and had several meetings several groups meeting regularly, as well as a newly framed building and even a stove by 1837. So this allowed meetings to occur in the winter as well. So prior to that, when it was cold, really, really cold, they didn't have church because it was just too cold in the building. This building held up until the framed building held up until the 1850s, when discussion of renovations led to a new building. All right, so this is an image from the 1950s of what the church basically looked like for about 100 years. And newly discovered information in the memoirs of a man named John Lipscomb Johnson has proven that this existing building is not in the same location as the previous one, but we don't know exactly where that might have been. We do know that at one point both buildings were both standing about 150 feet apart. And so I have some conjecture as to where that might have been. And I think it probably was over on that side, although that's just my hunch. I don't guess we'll know with parking lots and things. So Johnson was a contemporary of Joshua L. Brockman. And Joshua L. Brockman is an interesting story. He was ordained here as a minister at the young age of 18. It's hard to imagine that at 18 years old he was serving as a deacon. He went away to attend Columbian College to become a minister, and sadly his health declined pretty rapidly, and he ended up passing away around age 27. And he was the great-great-uncle of Mrs. Jean Graves, and this image comes from one of her scrapbooks and was sent to me by her nephew, Lynn Sullivan, who lives in Alabama. So Jean has had scrapbook upon scrapbook of pictures like this, and so it'll be interesting to see what else we might be able to find in some of those old scrapbooks. So it wasn't until 1855 that the church officially owned the land on which it had existed for roughly 80 years. And the next slide is a deed of from the Brockmans. The Brockmans deeded the land to the Kendalls, who were the trustees at the time. And Ray actually sent this to me, and when I started digging, I found a very similar looking deed the same week for Macedonia. And so we have always known that these two churches on this road have had connections, and so probably the Brockmans just deeded land to both churches because they had connections to both. So here's another minister, James Powell, and he served for about 20 years, and his wife was a Stevens, and the Stevens were big landowners in the Pamunkey community. So that's probably how they ended up here. And I'll tell you a story about James Powell in just a moment that's sort of connected to some other events I'm going to talk about. So Dr. Charles Quarles was the minister during the Civil War era, and records from this time are really sparse. Even the Goshen minutes were abbreviated in 2-year increments, and partially because the meetings were so poorly attended. There's a lot of discussion in those minutes about just how bad things were. Really neat story. 6 weeks before they were supposed to meet in 1862, the moderator, William Broadus, was arrested by Union soldiers and basically used as a pawn to secure the release of POWs that were being held in Richmond. And so he was allowed to go back and forth, and even though he was arrested, he had a little bit of freedom and movement. So even with the Civil War happening in the area, church membership did remain strong during this era, with reported 271 members. There was also a sad story in the Goshen Minutes about Reverend Powell, and it said that he and William Tandy Burris Fraser, who attended Pamunkey, were walking the Cedar Mountain battlefield looking for dead and wounded. And Reverend Powell was there to look for his young son, who was killed on the battlefield there. And he had also lost another son at Cold Harbor. So he lost 2 young sons in the Civil War. And Mr. Reverend Powell did not preach much longer after this. I think he was just too brokenhearted. Another Civil War veteran was J.W. McCown, and he was our next minister. He lived in Gordonsville and is buried at Maplewood Cemetery. And the Bible behind me was his. It has a date of 1879 on it, and he came in 1877. And although we can't open it up today and look inside, it has handwritten notes on the passages that he used for his sermons. Of course, the aftermath of the Civil War drastically changed the membership of North Pamunkey. Although there was no breakdown by race for most years, over half of the members were probably local slaves. And while lists are very limited, I did find a membership list dated 1818 to 1836 that did have the names of some slaves and the last names of their owners. Beginning around 1870, many African Americans formed their own churches. The old Shady Grove building is pictured here. Sadly, it has been torn down. And Shady Grove's beginnings are well documented. But some of the founders' surnames are White, Ellis, Jackson, Henderson, Mansfield, and Coleman. So those are all names that are kind of connected in with this neighborhood. Walker J. Decker was a very popular minister at Pamunkey for 28 years. Membership grew during his years of leadership. And some of the members during this time are very unexpected. This is Squire May. I found this image at the Smithsonian. Squire May was a freedman, and I have found several Freedmen Bureau records about Squire May. His first wife was Clea Madison, and after she passed away, he remarried, and his second wife's name was Rose Anna Terrell. So I have a very strong hunch that she is connected to the Terrells down the way at Danton. May's son Alexander was a member of Shady Grove. And this is a man who in our bicentennial program is discussed as being a very active member during business meetings. The second man, and I'm just starting to learn about Temple Littlepage. This is from a 1898 freelance article. And the Goshen Minutes were discussing him as being the sexton of Pamunkey for over 40 years. And the article also said that he was in his 90s at the time, in 1898. I'm still trying to find more information out about him, but I haven't found a whole lot yet. These men were attending Pamunkey during Decker's time, and that's a time when we would assume that the membership had become exclusively white, but these 2 instances show us that, in fact, they were not. Decker had many accomplishments and aid to the church during this time, including purchasing 2 acres for a cemetery, and Mr. Decker is the first minister to be buried there. He died in 1928, and we actually placed a flag on his grave today as we did our Memorial Day service. In the early 1900s, many firsts happened. The Sunbeams, a preschool missions group, was organized. The health department urged that individual communion cups should be used for the first time, so no need for the communion silver there. And the sanctuary got electricity. Finally, 1920. Miss Eleanor Decker was chosen for a leadership role during this time, and that's the first instance of a woman being mentioned in a leadership role, 1922. Miss Decker was a local teacher and remained an active member until her passing in 1954. So we probably have some folks amongst us who may remember her a little bit. Some other ministers have been Frank C. Riley, also a minister at Orange Baptist and a founder of the Orange County Fire Department. Marshall Fraser, he was born and raised and ordained at Pamunkey. I recently discovered his ordination ceremony upstairs. in writing from 1907. And while he was here, the first parsonage was purchased from G.W. Morton, and it's still a residence today. If you're familiar with Marquis Road, right across the bridge up on the hill, there's an old 1800s house, maybe even late 1700s house, and that was the first parsonage. Fraser resigned due to poor health in 1944, and after he left, the church did enter a period of decline in membership. That was revitalized later by the strong leadership of F. Bernard Lasore. During this time, Joint Vacation Bible School was begun at with Macedonia Church. The biggest change was the addition of the Sunday school wing and the remodeling of the interior sanctuary. Where these half windows are today is approximately where the windows were before the wing was added behind us. And the baptistry was also added at that time, and so people no longer had to go down to the river to be baptized. You didn't have to wait for the weather to be perfect and the water to be warm enough. The dedication for the wing was attended by nearly 400 people, and it was not unusual at this time to have over 150 people in attendance for Sunday school. Of course, there were many other ministers as well, but all were before my time, and my knowledge of them is very limited to what others could tell me. But here's the list. And by the way, we are currently getting an engraved stone made so that we will have a list of all of our ministers that will hang in the church for everybody to be able to see. So this slide is about Bud Jones. Bud was a local dairyman and the brother of our most elder member, Ray Jones. Bud probably still holds the record for perfect attendance. He began to be recognized for this achievement back in the 70s. The bottom right is his last pin, and he's pictured there with Pastor Jeff White and Dwight Paschal. And he received that in 2004, which was also the year that he passed away. So if my memory is correct, he was always recognized on Mother's Day, as his mother made sure that he was here every Sunday. In 1969, the old parsonage was sold, and a new parsonage was built across the lane from the church, and every minister from 1970 to 2008 lived in the parsonage, and it is still owned by the church. And the next slide has some images of some of the ministers that served from the 50s through the 80s. In the upper right corner is Pop Johnson, who briefly served as interim pastor and also played the organ for a number of years. And his descendants still attend the church today, and many of them are here today. This is the parsonage. This is the groundbreaking for the parsonage, and then the parsonage when it was built. So when I was a little girl, Dr. Marvin Goebel was our pastor. His daughter Susanna was my best friend. She's the older girl in the picture. And even today, we're still in touch weekly. I was baptized by him along with my other best friend, Jackie. Marvin was well loved by this congregation. Our next pastor was Dr. Mike Hatfield. While he was here, the Julia Burris Fellowship Hall was built. Julia was really a force in our church, and she lived here long after her husband passed away and was a very active member of our church. Mike Hatfield has been in Martinsville for 25 years now, but still maintains many ties back here to Lahore, or Lay Ho, as he always calls it when he comes home. We're looking forward to a big celebration here in a few months, and we'll dress up just as we did for the 200th and the 225th. We are sticking to colonial attire this time, though. If you look closely, you'll see some hippies in one of those pictures. So far this century, we've experienced a lot, highs and lows. We have had a few leadership changes that caused some growing pains. A real bright spot has been our preschool. Blessed Assurance Christian School was begun in 2006. These little ones get to learn about Jesus every day, and it sticks with them. Our first graduates are now grown-ups who are getting married and starting their careers. Of course, I had to put the pictures that my little one, who's not so little anymore, is in. The leadership we've had over the past 15 years has kept us going strong. After strong interim pastors, Rick Wolf and Chet Smith, we were blessed with a bivocational minister, Brian Harris. Harris loved our congregation through some hard things, and God sent him to help us heal and to prepare our current pastor, Tim Jarrell, to transition into a leadership role. When Brian retired due to health reasons, Tim had already been filling in. As we considered what was next, it was clear our pastor was already among us. The past 8 years with Tim Jarrell as our pastor have been wonderful years for our church. We fellowship often and have many activities to invite folks in and spend quality time together. Some of our favorite activities are Fifth Sunday breakfast, senior breakfast held once a month, Christmas caroling, and of course, Vacation Bible School. Our congregation is growing, and we are excited for what God has in store for us. I'll end with an invitation. When my family moved to this community over 40 years ago, our first visitor was this wonderful woman right here. She brought I'm not going to cry. She brought a pie and an open invitation to visit North Pamunkey. Jean Craft Graves was one of the dearest people in my life, and I cherish all the time I was able to spend with her through the years. So much that I have learned about this community has come from her. She passed away 2 years ago, and oh, how I wish that she could see this big anniversary with us. So if you're looking for a church home, you're always welcome to join us here. We would love to have you. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
I think on the slide, about the 1830s slide, it said something about a Baptist society. What's that?
You know, there were things in the bicentennial that were the bulletin that was made, but it was there and nothing else was ever found about it. So we had a temperance society also, but all I found is that we had a temperance society and nothing else about it. So unfortunately, I don't know a whole lot about what that meant or what it looked like. I think if I went through some of the old Goshen minutes closely, I probably could dig out what that was, but I'll have to get back to you on that one.
Microphone, Frank.
Jennifer, you've cited these arrests.
Yes, sir.
So you have seen the difference between regular Baptists and separate Baptists.
Yes, sir.
Could you tell us a little bit about the difference between the two? Well, I probably set you up because when I was giving tours, I used to describe that.
Okay.
Because, of course, Elder John Leland was a regular Baptist. And he communicated with James Madison and all of the other leaders, got along with them well, took care of problems involving clashes between the dissenting churches and the Anglican Church. But then there was this group of wild people that they called the separate Baptists. And the way I used to describe it, of what a separate Baptist is like, is that it would be a spring morning, and you would be riding a horse down a wooded trail, and the birds are singing, and the dew is glistening on the leaves, and everything is peaceful, and somebody jumps out of the bushes, grabs your horse's bridle, and says, "Brother, are you saved?"
That's about right.
After your heart got back to beating regular again, you get arrested.
They were more spiritual. They had huge mass meetings. They'd camp out and there'd be hundreds of people ready to to worship, and the crowds were huge. And one of the things I think made the Separatists a little bit different is that they were really more, is ecumenical the right word? They really took anybody who wanted to come in and learn about the word. We were seen as, those Baptists because they were a little bit louder and a little bit more wild, and maybe the Separatists or the regulars were a little more buttoned up than the Separatists were.
Second question while I got you. Did you follow Elijah Craig into Kentucky much?
Yes, sir, I did.
So he founded the Georgetown, Kentucky, and the University of Georgetown.
Yes, sir.
Right. I was taught by a graduate of the University of Georgetown.
Wow. That's very interesting. I did follow him and his activities. He had a paper mill. He grew hemp. He did all kinds of things. But of course, what has stuck through history is that bourbon.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's another question back here.
I can talk loud. Did you get any chance to perhaps, because Frank had mentioned Elder John Leland, did you have much chance to talk to Pastor Don Campbell and some of his knowledge on Goshen and some of the old documents? Just wondering if that ever crossed your path.
I went to the Goshen and I did go through a fair amount of documentation. I did not talk to Don Campbell. Joy Dickens helped me a lot. And I talked to John Miller a lot, and went through some of Leland's writings, but the book's like that thick. And after you've done about 4 or 5 hours of researching, your eyes start to kind of cross, and I had to there were several days when I was researching that I just had to say, okay, Jennifer, you have to stop now because you're going cross-eyed. Because all that reading just, over time, it's very dense. Yes.
Good work.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I guess I need to grab the mic. You conjectured where the frame building was prior to this one. Do you have any conjecture on the original log building that predated that?
I don't. I do think it could have been a little bit more that way because, just through the parsonage area, if you turn down Matthews Mill, you're on Brockman land or Brockman Woolfolk land. So I think and they probably owned, up this road. So I think it probably was, it could have been in that field there for all we know. But there just aren't records to help us figure that part out, unfortunately.
Can you talk a little bit about the dating and the current structure and the additions as well? The modern plan?
Sure. So this box that we're in would be around 1853. And so we do have a balcony, and so that is where slaves would have come if they came to participate in the service. There were 2 front doors because most meeting houses had 2 front doors at that time, and a lot of them, men went in one door, women in the other, and sometimes they also sat separately at church. So the building pretty much stays like that until 1953, 54, when they build the wing, which is through the doors here. And so our Sunday school wing is actually 3 floors. There's a basement, which is where our preschool is today, and it was our social hall in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. I remember lots of little parties down there, and some kind of All Saints Fest where the piñata got broken and I got busted in the nose. I remember that very well. But so the wing is 3 floors. Basement, main floor with the several Sunday school rooms, nursery, restrooms for the first time. And we just remodeled our restrooms this year, and they are so nice. They are so nice because we had little teeny bathrooms before that. And then upstairs we have more Sunday school rooms. And most of the rooms are used on Sunday for our different Sunday school classes. And then in 1999, the fellowship hall was built, and that was built pretty much entirely by the hands within the church. I think Cecil Middleton told me that he nailed every single nail except for one. Except for one. So that was added in 1999. And I forgot to mention the vestibule where you came in. That was added around 1976. And Ray Jones and I believe Dick Burris went somewhere in Crozet, he was telling me, and they found this little nice covering that they thought would be good for us to have some kind of space where people could, gather coming in or coming out. And so I think it's 1976 that they built the vestibule one. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you all for coming to hear the presentation.
Thank you.